I'm Ulysses from SSW TV. We're here at NDC 2019, and I'm here talking to Richard Campbell about the moon.
Okay, sort of, yeah.
So somehow NASA called you and asked you to go to them to tell them about their plan to go to the moon.
Right.
How did this happen?
I made, we make .NET Rocks. We make lots of .NET Rocks episodes. And for a long time, once a month, I would do whatever geeky subject the audience wants. I'm a researcher by nature. Like, that's just what I find fun and tend to keep a lot of notes and things. And so these geek out episodes were just a way to sort of get a story together and tell an hour-long conversation or description about something. And it was actually the European Space Agency had produced a document. This is towards the end of 2016, talking about the idea of establishing a base on the moon, very much like bases in Antarctica. And in fact, it was they wanted it on the South Pole of the moon because they've discovered water there. And I thought that was really interesting. And, I made a Geek Out episode about that and the overall story of what's going on with the moon in the past few years in the March of 2017. And then by that summer, apparently it had gotten around NASA. And so they emailed me first, and I didn't believe it was them because how often do you get an email from @nasa.gov? But no, it was a real thing. And they asked me if I would do a presentation. So that fall, I went to the NASA Ames facility, which is outside of San Francisco, and did this presentation. And that got around that I'd done this presentation to NASA, and it got asked if I would do it at conferences. And so I've kind of been doing it ever since, although the one you probably saw this week is a new version. For one thing, between 2017 and today, there's been a lot more activity about going back to the moon.
Right,
and
the moon is hot right now.
Yeah, it is. And there's been a couple of attempted landings recently. The Beershot lander got close, and the Vikram lander also got close. The Chinese Chang'e 4 landed successfully on the far side of the moon, first time ever. The Chinese actually had to put up a satellite in the L2 Lagrange point 2 past the moon to be able to communicate with their lander, which is a genuine next level a bit of technology that the Chinese have accomplished there. So the energy around the moon is high. So I think I've caught a wave that I had all of this stuff prepared and could sort of talk through what we could do actually putting humans on the moon routinely.
Right. Okay. So the new plan, or the current plan, is the Artemis.
It's Artemis being the twin to Apollo in Greek mythology. So it's kind of where the name comes from. Although Andy Weir used it for his book too, right? He did a new book on the moon called Artemis. But that's their new plan, and it's an accelerated plan by the U.S. government to try and get people back on the moon by 2024.
When was that announced?
That's been that was announced this year.
Okay.
There was already additional activity in last year as well, but they're really pushing now, including this month being October of 2019. NASA put out to tender proposals for lunar landers, where the response to the tender, the RFP, had to be filed by November 1. So they gave them 30 days, which not a lot of time, pretty much guarantees. About a dozen companies have said they will tender. And most of them are your usual suspects, your Boeing, your Lockheed Martins, your Northrop Grumman's, Orbital ATK, SpaceX, Blue Origin, that already have plans because you couldn't start from scratch with only a month. And so it is interesting to see how rapidly they're trying to move forward about this.
And so what's involved in the Artemis mission? They want to get there by 2024? What are their stages?
So they're taking a different approach than Apollo. When Apollo was initially developed, they tried to do what was called a direct ascent. So a single vehicle launched on a single stack that would fly to the moon, land on the moon, and fly back. They ended up doing what's called an orbital rendezvous approach, where they packed both spacecraft, both the command module and the lunar excursion module, into the same rocket stack, but they had to reattach them, do that rendezvous part in orbit, and then went to the moon. The lander landed on the moon, a portion of it came back up, and then they flew home. For Artemis, they're looking to put more infrastructure in place. And so one of the big parts of the proposal is this thing called the Lunar Gateway. And it's a space station that they would orbit around the moon. And it looks like a little international space station. But it's designed a little differently. For starters, it's in an unusual orbit called a near halo rectilinear orbit. So if the moon is here, it's orbiting like this, close to the North Pole, then far from the South Pole. It's about a week-long orbit. It always faces the Earth, and it always faces the sun. And so it doesn't need the batteries that the International Space Station has to deal with, because it's in 45 minutes of light, 45 minutes of dark. And it's really meant as a human-tended station. So a place where humans would go and stay for 60 days. And it would be staging ground to go down to the surface or to operate robots on the surface, because you're closer to the moon that way. And also to provide a little infrastructure. There's interest in going further into the solar system, right? And I actually talk about in this session that the moon is a gateway to the rest of the solar system. Things we learn to do on the moon, we can apply to Mars and to other parts of our solar system. And so part of that lunar gateway is a place to really start to experiment with deep space, human-occupied spacecraft traveling distances. There's not a lot of difference between a small space station and a ship you might take to Mars.
Sure, but we already have a space station, the International Space Station.
We do.
Another one.
Well, and we've had others before, right? There was the Mir space station. There were all the Salutes. There was Skylab, which they scattered all over your country. The International Space Station has become it taught us about working with multiple countries to build a station. It is specifically a microgravity laboratory. And they've learned a lot about microgravity in the process, right? Especially what it does to humans. So most of the knowledge we now have about how humans survive in microgravity comes from the International Space Station. And one of the things we've learned is that really you don't want to leave someone in free fall for longer than about 6 months at the maximum. And even with that 6 months, to keep them healthy, they're going to exercise 2.5 hours a day. And when you think about the cost it takes to put an astronaut into orbit, and of their waking hours, 2.5 hours is going to be dedicated to maintaining body health. It's a lot. And even then, it's not enough. So we've figured out that all the peristaltic processes, so the way your blood pumps and the way you digest food, that all works, although you can't burp.
Really?
Well, because the food's floating around your stomach, right? So if you burp, it's going to be a little chunky.
For 6 months.
Although I've seen a video of an astronaut showing how to burp on the space station, where they literally back up against a wall, and when they go to burp, they push off so that all the food drops to the bottom of their stomach, and that lets the gas out. And if you get it wrong, you have to clean it up.
Great.
These are the problems. But the real issue is the cerebral spinal fluid. So there's a couple of organs inside your brain that emit this fluid that essentially bathes and cleans your brain. And that fluid runs down into your spinal cord as well, where it actually does membrane exchange to get rid of that debris, which then gets flushed out of your body. And that fluid system has no peristaltic pumps. It basically relies on motion and gravity. And medical professionals know if you have a bedridden patient, you need to sit them up at least once a day. And part of it is this cerebral spinal fluid motion. Right. So it's important to do that. So in free fall, the fluid doesn't flow into your spine at all. In fact, it builds up in your head to the point where it presses against your eyes and bends them. So you'll notice that astronauts on the space station, their faces are puffy and they all wear glasses because their eyes are literally distorted by the fluid in their brains.
Oh, wow.
And so there are consequences of that, damage to the eyes and problems with the fluid circulating system that just can't be solved. You need some gravity.
Right.
I would also say this. At the end of the 6 months when you leave the space station and you land back on Earth, you are disabled, right? You're quite wobbly. Your balance is the same. The bottoms of your feet hurt because you haven't been stepping on them for months. And so it's interesting to consider an idea like a mission to Mars, where it'll take about 6 months to get to Mars. And then you would go through the violence of landing on Mars, and there's nobody to help you. What happens next? Like, how long does it take for a group of folks to get strong enough to be able to function? So, I don't think we're ready to go to Mars yet. We need to develop some more technology, and things that we've done on the space station and could be doing on the moon are all included in that. The only way we can make artificial gravity right now is with a centrifuge. Like, irrespective of anything you've seen in any science fiction movies, we have to simply spin stuff around. And there was a proposal to put a centrifuge on the International Space Station at one point, but then they sort of realized, hey, this will interfere with all of the microgravity experiments. It's going to shake the whole space station. So they ended up not actually deploying it. The only time there was ever a centrifuge in free fall was a small one that was tested on the space shuttle once. Other than that, we've really never done any experiments with centrifuges.
Actually, it's interesting you bring up the space shuttle. What happened to the space shuttle? I know NASA has been all about the space shuttle for decades.
Yes. Well, the first shuttle flew in 1981 and the last one flew in 2011. It was an ambitious project that was maybe a little ahead of its time and underfunded. So the intent of the space shuttle was to build an aircraft-like experience to space, in the sense that you fly to space, you do your thing, you come back, you rapidly refurbish and fly again. They expected to fly any given shuttle every week. And in reality, they never flew any of them more than twice in a year, generally only once a year. And in the original designs, they were looking at an orbital vehicle that attached to a flyback booster, basically a giant aircraft that would propel the orbiter close to orbit, and then the orbiter would take off from there and go up, and the big piece would then turn around and land. And you could refuel it and refurbish it and get ready to go again. In the end, in the interest of cost controls, they got rid of that flyback booster. It was the limits of what they could possibly do, and went with a tank and solid rocket boosters. And that it made for a very dangerous design. There's a few things in the end that were very challenging with the shuttle. The first is when you put an orbital vehicle on the side of a rocket rather than on the top of a rocket, it takes a lot of abuse. And in fact, that's what killed Columbia, was that a piece of frozen foam came off the external tank, struck the wing root of Columbia in exactly the right place and punched a hole in it. And that ultimately caused the loss of the vehicle and all of its passengers on reentry. It's also it wasn't easy to reuse it. Not that it was particularly broken, but that it took so much inspecting. They essentially disassembled every shuttle when it landed. The 3 big main engines came out and had to be refurbished because the stress that they went through running hydrolox fuel meant that blades were cracked and needed to be repaired. Every shuttle tile had to be inspected. Those tiles were incredibly fragile. They're very effective, but you could break them with your hands, and the abuse of coming and going out of an atmosphere was tough on them. And so just the hours and hours and hours of labor to prepare a shuttle to make it as safe as it could be, it never could be cost effective. Now, admittedly, it was largely 70s technology, and it had a refit in the 90s to a little bit more sophisticated electronics and weight reduction and working with space stations and so forth. It also, mixing heavy payloads and passengers is a mistake. It's just dangerous, right? So only a small portion of the shuttle was the pressurized compartment. The largest part of the shuttle was this large payload bay that could carry almost 30 tons. Typically 27 tons was the maximum. And that mixture of large payload bay and small pressurized area meant that there were lots of failure modes that resulted in the loss of the shuttle. You want a more compact, more robust vehicle that you put people into that can tolerate failures. And the shuttle just couldn't. And Challenger's loss in 86 was a conflagration. I mean, the fuel went all off at once. But because the ship was relatively fragile, it broke apart. And there's an argument that a smaller version of the ship, a passenger-only version of the vehicle, might have survived. Not that I recommend doing that, but it was a vehicle that was compromised in a lot of different ways, and still flew 135 times with 2 failures. Achieved some extraordinary things. They recovered satellites. They launched Hubble. They repaired Hubble multiple times and improved it. They built a space station. Like, it's an extraordinary machine, but never lived up to its potential.
So you mentioned a number of private companies who are getting involved now. So SpaceX, Blue Origin, etc.
Yes.
In the days of Apollo, it was kind of just the space agencies, the government space agencies.
Well, the government space agencies would contract out to typically military contractors, your Boeings, Rockwell, Northrop Grumman, McDonnell Douglas, all those sorts of companies. But the distinction would be the kind of contract they would offer. And in fact, an awful lot of work today is still done under what they call cost-plus contracting, especially when you're talking about true innovative work. We've never made one of these before, so you can't really set a price. And so instead, the contract simply said, the government will pay all of the costs, however much it costs to build this thing, plus bonuses based on delivery times and capabilities. The downside to that system is that you're more and more incented to make sure everything is right, to test to the nth degree, and less incented to be efficient in any of that. And so cost overruns are very common, and delays are very common. When NASA started producing the commercial orbital transport service, the COTS contracts, these were contracts to bring supplies to the space station at a fixed rate. That basically, we want you to move this much stuff to the space station, a certain amount down. We'll pay this much for it. How you do it, up to you. And two different companies won that original contract. One was SpaceX with their Falcon 9 and the Dragon capsule, and the other one was Orbital ATK with their Cygnus carrier on the Antares. What was interesting about it is that it appears that over time the companies made more money as they got more efficient at operations and manufactured their rockets less expensively and sort of tuned things. It actually made sense to do that. It cost NASA less, and it made those companies money so that they were willing to optimize it and continue to improve their systems. If you look at an original Falcon 9 from the beginning of the COTS contract to today's Falcon 9, their Block 5 rocket, they're very different rockets. They evolved a lot.
So SpaceX, I guess the most famous thing about SpaceX is Elon Musk and the fact that they've kind of developed this system for reusable orbital boosters or whatever.
Yeah, landing first stages on their tails.
Yeah.
It's an act of magic. Yes.
Yeah. So rather than having that part just fly up and launch whatever you want to launch and then it just crashes back
falls
into the
ocean. Yeah.
They get to reuse that part, and that part's very expensive.
Yes.
So that dematerializes the whole process a lot.
You would hope. We don't know exactly how much SpaceX saves by recovering their booster, because they've never published the figures. They have reused the boosters, but we don't know how much disassembly they've done, how many engines they replaced. They talk about it, but there's just not a lot of published figures on it. So we presume they've reduced costs dramatically, but they had already done that with their rocket. It was already sub $2,000 a kilogram before reusability worked. So we don't actually have hard numbers on if it saved that much. We presume it did. Right, that those engines are valuable and that they could be reused. But the Merlin engine, while extraordinarily efficient, this is the engine on the Falcon 9, is a Kerolox engine. And so you're burning kerosene and liquid oxygen. And so it leaves residues in the engine. Like it's fairly tough on engines, especially at altitude. The low pressure actually creates more acid. So we don't actually know how well those engines survive for reuse. There are better fuels that if you knew you were going to reuse an engine, that you would use over Kerolox, which is what they're building now, right? Their Raptor engine, which is a Methalox engine where it's using liquid methane and liquid oxygen, burns much cleaner and has fewer byproducts on the engine. And so there's a very good chance that those engines should be more reusable than even the Merlins are. Not that we really know how reusable Merlins are.
Right. Is SpaceX the only one doing reusable?
So far, now Blue Origin has a vehicle. This is Jeff Bezos' company, so another tech billionaire. Although he's funded it very differently. He, being the wealthiest man in the world, he says, I basically sell $1 billion worth of Amazon stock a year, and I put it into Blue Origin. So they have a vehicle called New Shepard. Now, New Shepard is a suborbital class rocket, so it can't go into orbit, but it can get above the Kármán line. And in theory, it's for recreational use. For some fee, I think it's going to be a couple $100,000. You can go and experience free fall for a few minutes in a New Shepard rocket. And that booster is relandable and has relanded and reflown multiple times on the same rocket. Again, they haven't really published all the data, but they have literally flown the same rocket 5 times and shown that they could do that. Now, I want to be very clear. This is a very apples and oranges comparison. They both may be rockets, but the velocities and distances involved in an orbital class booster versus a suborbital class booster are not comparable. The violence that those orbital class Block 5 first stages from Falcon 9 go through to be able to re-enter and survive, they take a pounding compared to the suborbital rocket. Blue Origin is working on a new rocket called New Glenn. And New Glenn is a dramatically larger rocket. So the Falcon 9 rocket is a 3.7 meter diameter rocket. And it's that size because it fits on highways. Right? This is how they're able to build the rockets in California and take them all the way to Florida. The New Glenn rocket's supposed to be a 7-meter rocket, so literally twice the size, running on BE-4 engines, which is a Methalox engine developed by Blue Origin. So it will be a heavy lift rocket if it works as designed. We've never seen one. We know that Blue Origin has rented pad space and ground space at Kennedy at the Kennedy Space Center, and that they have built some enormous buildings, and there are things going on there, but nobody really knows. They say they're flying starting in 2021.
Right. So they're manufacturing on site, so they don't need to go on the highway.
Exactly, to solve that particular problem. And at the same time, SpaceX is also working on a new rocket, their Starship and Heavy Booster, and they have 2 sites, one in Boca Chica, Texas, and the other one also near the Kennedy Space Center. So they're also recognizing good to construct close to your launch site.
So Bezos and Musk have been sort of publicly, I guess, they're both well-known tech celebrities. And they've got very different ideas about how we should go about becoming a multiplanetary species.
Well, Bezos has not talked about being a multiplanetary species. That's Musk's goal.
I suppose he did criticize Musk's plan to go to Mars. He thinks the moon's more important.
Well, yeah, he's more in what he sort of stated goal is to move polluting industry off the planet.
Right.
That was his stated goal. And certainly the moon could facilitate operations of various kinds of industries up there. There are things on the moon that are very useful that you could do some mining, refining, manufacturing on the moon. And you're right. Blue Origin has come out specifically with their Blue Moon Initiative, which they want to sell delivery services to the moon to NASA, that they think they can build a precision lander and can bring routine amounts of supplies and perhaps even people to the moon for them. And Musk hasn't hesitated, given the energy around the moon, to say, sure, we could fly our rocket to the moon if you want us to, if and when their new rocket works. The Falcon 9 has flown a payload to the moon. That was the Beresheet lander. The Space IL lander came off of a Falcon 9. But there's not a lot of mass that'll make it to the moon off of that rocket. Heavy could lift more. The Falcon Heavy is basically 3 Falcon 9s strapped together, although the center core is a bit more complex. The problem is, while it has a lot of lift, it has a limited payload capacity. It's only a 5-meter fairing, which is relatively small for the kinds of things you might want to lift to the moon. And they have sort of pushed the design of the Falcon 9 to the absolute limit. There's this equation in rocketry called the fineness ratio, and it's basically the proportion of the diameter of the rocket to its length. And you're usually looking at an optimized rocket at 15 to 1, so 15 times longer than it is wide. Falcon Heavy is 18 to 1, so it's already over long. And so if you were to go and try and equip a larger payload fairing, something taller and wider, you'd be stressing arguably the weakest part of the rocket, and it probably is past its design limits. So they need a different rocket. And then rather than building something like what Bezos is building with New Glenn, I mean, that 7-meter rocket, I think that's well inside of, like, Musk could build that rocket, right? We've seen everything he needs, but instead he's skipping to an even crazier rocket, right? This absolutely enormous 100-ton lift, 100% reusable rocket. If it works, it'll change everything. But this is a big leap. It would be very challenging to make that work.
Well, he's good at big leaps, mostly.
I don't know that he actually is. The Falcon 9 has been an incremental rocket. And I think it's part of why we like him so much. The way that he does rocketry is the way it was done in the 1960s. Where they build it and they fly it, then they tweak it and they build it and they fly it. It's a little bit better each time, but there's always stuff to watch. As opposed to mostly what the traditional rocketry companies are doing these days, your Boeings and your Lockmarts, where it's planning, and then one flight. Right. And it's not fun for us. You know, but they don't experiment and they fly the same thing every time. But part of that is just the way that their contracts are built. That's what the government is essentially asking for, as opposed to the way that Musk is taking it on. It's good for PR. And so far his failures have been non-fatal and relatively non-dramatic, although there's no rocketry failures that aren't somewhat dramatic.
Slightly explosive.
Yes. Rapid disassembly events.
All right. So we've got an International Space Station.
Okay.
Theoretically, we're going to get an American-owned Gateway space station.
Oh no, they were also talking international participation in the Gateway as well.
Okay.
So Europe is signed on for a module. The Americans are obviously building a module. The Canadians are building a robot arm. Surprise! We built all the other ones, so we're also going to do that. Japan's talking about doing a lander and a rover. Even the Russians have made an offer for a laboratory, although considering current conditions between the U.S. and Russia, I don't know if that's actually going to happen. And the Australians are in the Artemis program as well. There was an announcement in September of 2019 that the Australian Space Agency would be participating in Artemis. I don't know exactly in what capacity. They haven't really talked a whole lot about that.
We have good dishes.
Well, I'm sure there'll be something, right? I mean, yeah, the Deep Space Network has a big piece across Australia and is part of the tracking of the space station and so forth.
Okay.
But what's interesting about that space station is not only is it a place for us to go that's close to the moon and a place to do new classes of experiment, and I also say a place for us to learn more, get better at space stations. Like we've made some mistakes with the International Space Station that I think they want to correct and experiment with in a new space station. But it also then represents an international commitment. The U.S. space program struggles over changing administrations. Each time an administration changes, often the plans get redone and more set back. They've been working on the Space Launch System, this shuttle-derived rocketry system, since the Bush administration and still haven't flown. They're closer than ever, but it's gone very slowly. And part of that has been reprioritization by different administrations over and over and over again. But when you make an international commitment like the space station, you kind of have to stick to it. And I think it's a smart move. It's a way to overcome the limitations of your political system and still do good by civilization.
So does it matter who owns? I'm thinking from a sort of I'm English, so I'm thinking from a imperial standpoint.
Yes, great question.
Does it matter who owns the moon base?
Well, that is an interesting question because who could own the moon base? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 pretty much declared all territory outside of the Earth, like Antarctica, for research only, for everyone to share, that you couldn't really claim it.
Can't flag it.
Yeah, you can put the flag down on it, but you got to say, we came here for all mankind, which is exactly what the Americans did the 12 times they landed, or the 6 times they landed with the 12 people. But that does introduce an interesting problem, right? I wondered when they were getting ready to shut down Mir, if somebody had gone there and hopped on and basically said, "Hey, we're just going to stay here," like, what would you do? Right? You don't really want to kill them.
Squatters.
Yeah, they're basically squatting, and the legal system kind of allows it. So if and when folks start building stuff on the moon, and there's every evidence that it's going to happen this time, what happens if someone else shows up? What happens if you have a major find of an ore body that's really important and other people start mining it as well? So I think we've been okay with the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 because we haven't had to challenge it. I strongly suspect things will change as activities and expenditures take place.
Yeah, well, if we talk about industry on the moon, if we have power plants out there or giant solar arrays or whatever.
Or a mining facility, a manufacturing facility, you start making spaceships in space. Like there's all these things we could be doing up there. Yeah, ownership's going to be a factor.
Yeah. So we've talked about microgravity experimentation, which we can also do on the International Space Station.
Yes.
We've talked about potential polluting industries. Could you, and this may be a very stupid question, so please forgive me, could you terraform the moon?
To what exactly?
Something habitable, in case we stuff up Earth.
Yeah, well, we're doing a pretty good job of stuffing up Earth. And for any amount of money you could spend to do anything to the moon or any other body, you're better off spending that money on the Earth cleaning up your mess. What we've learned in planetary science in the past decade or so, a lot of the research we have done around Mars and the explorations of the moons at Saturn and Jupiter with Cassini and Galileo and all of the missions to Mars, is that you need a strong magnetic field. That the biggest issue for the most planetary bodies is hydrogen stripping. The solar wind tears hydrogen out of your atmosphere. So today, scientists are talking about that there once was water, that Mars was a wet, oceany world, and so was Venus. And in both cases, their magnetic fields were weak enough that the solar wind was able to strip the hydrogen out of their atmosphere. And in the case of Venus, then that free oxygen, because that hydrogen was actually bound to water, that oxygen then bound to carbon, and we had this carbon dioxide runaway hellhole that is Venus. And in the case of Mars, it largely bound to iron, which is why the planet is red. But both cases, they've lost hydrogen. Our Earth has this remarkably strong magnetic field for its size. And there's a lot of theories as to why that is, the moon being a factor in it, that keeps the atmosphere from being stripped by solar radiation. So a moon wouldn't be a good target. Its mass is too low. Its magnetic field is too weak. Its core is probably pretty close to cold. It's not going to be able to hold on to an atmosphere. Right. And this is the same struggle that Mars has. Now, there's things you could do.
Mars is bigger, though. Mars is what?
Mars is about 10th the size of Earth, but much bigger than the moon.
Yeah.
But still too small, and its magnetic field is largely collapsed. And there's a variety of reasons they're talking about why that might be. But you could put a device that sat in the L1, the Lagrange point 1, which is basically a gravitationally stable spot between the sun and your body in question, whether that be Mars or the moon, and have it emit a strong magnetic field, basically an umbrella. So now you can keep the solar wind from bombarding your body, and you could do this on the moon. You still have all the other problems, right? And one would argue, and a lot of the recent experimentation and research in the moon, in the past 10 years or so, has shown that an awful lot of the most interesting things on the moon are coming from solar wind. That the constant bombardment of high energy protons, essentially hydrogen with its electrons stripped off, creates chemical and electrostatic interactions on the moon that may be forming water and other hydroxyls. Like, we should probably understand that before we really mess with it. But yeah, the moon wouldn't be a great place to terraform. The only terraforming we've ever done is on the Earth. We've pretty much done bad terraforming. So I would work on us getting better here before we start worrying about what we could do elsewhere.
Right. Fair enough. So I guess the whole, at the moment, the SpaceX talk of going to Mars is not to terraform Mars, it's to set up Antarctic style. That's
pretty much what it's going to look like. Reasonable habitation on Mars is going to likely be underground just for radiation protection.
Same on the moon?
Yeah, certainly on the moon. And in both cases, there has been volcanic activity on both the moon and Mars. And so we know there are lava tubes. There's actually some upcoming missions from Japan to specifically go to the Marius skylight, which is essentially a hole in the moon over an enormous lava tube, something close to 80 meters tall. So this is where lava once flowed through under the surface of the moon, and then the lava drained away and left a hard, massive tunnel, which would give us meteoroid protection and radiation protection. We just have to insert a habitat into that space. So imagine we could bring something inflatable, seal it off in there, and pretty much have a ready-made structure in a lot of respects. It's an interesting idea. It's one part of that. Challenging to live underground, right? We kind of think we want to be able to see outside, although I don't know that seeing outside with that harsh sun without an atmosphere and so forth would be all that pleasant, much less the radiation exposure and micrometeoroid risk that it represents.
Yeah. Okay, you've talked about Lagrange points. So just for our audience, and because I looked this up yesterday, Lagrange point is a zero gravity point between two bodies.
It's a gravitational balance point.
Yeah. So
where gravity seems to pull equally. So they talk about it in terms of dwells. It's sort of in a certain area you can dwell. You don't sit still. Often you're moving in sort of a figure eight pattern in that spot.
Right.
But you can stay there for quite some time. And so this is sort of standard three-body math. Where you have two gravitational objects and you have your object, which should probably be substantially lighter, and you can find various points to balance from. And we utilize those fairly regularly, typically the L1s and L2s. So the L1 is sort of an interior balance point. Given two bodies, there's an L1 somewhere here, and the L2 would be on the far side of that smaller body.
Which is orbiting.
So if you're talking about Earth, one of the pictures I start off with on that particular talk is a picture of the Earth from the Discover satellite, which is in the Sun-Earth L1. So it's about 1.5 million kilometers away from the Earth, but substantially farther away from the Sun. And that's that sort of gravitational balance point that it floats in, moves in its figure eight. And so it always has a continuous view of the Sun and a continuous view of the Earth. It's between the two. Right. And then the L2 would be on the opposite, about the same distance, opposite side of the Earth. And that's roughly where they're talking about putting the James Webb Space Telescope.
Right. So I heard something that might be madness, which is putting that L1 point between the Earth and the Moon, putting a space station there, maybe with a space elevator from either the Earth or the Moon,
So the Earth Moon L1 is fairly small and unstable. So we generally don't use it because it's just such a close. We're only talking 400,000 kilometers. So the point where you get that balance is small enough. It's going to be hard to stay in it with anything of any substantial size. In sort of the history of space technology, we talked about O'Neill colonies at the L5, which is a balance point trailing the Earth against the sun, which is more interesting. Space elevator is an interesting idea, and what you're essentially building a balanced tether. So it actually sits at that balance point, the bulk of the mass, and then extends on either side of it. And the tether is long enough that it touches the surface. We would love to build one on the Earth because it would save launch costs dramatically. The challenge is it's a lot of gravity and a lot of atmosphere to resist. So the material strengths are sort of beyond comprehension. We've started to see materials like carbon nanotubes and nanodiamonds that come into the class of strength, but we can't build them anywhere near large enough or cost effectively. The moon, with so much less gravity, with 17% of Earth's gravity, it should be easier to build that. But now you're talking about a tidally locked body. So it's tricky.
Can you explain tidally locked?
So the same face of the moon always faces the Earth, right? So you don't have the same rotational effects. You'd like to put it on the near side, but now you run into that very narrow spot of an L1. An L2 on the other side might be more interesting, but you're further from the Earth. So it's not actually a useful device for getting to and from the Earth so much. And you're only talking about 2 kilometers per second of delta V to get off the surface of the moon.
Right. So it's not big cost savings there.
Yeah.
Launching from the moon is easy enough.
Launching from the moon is easy enough for rocket engines off by themselves, and also linear accelerators. So you could imagine I could pretty much give you a kilometer a second off of a reasonable length piece of rail with a bit of a ski jump at the end. Yeah. So almost half of the amount of thrust you'd need to get off the surface of the moon, we could probably do that with a linear accelerator, not turn you into goo in the process, which is a feature. Although if I'm only shipping cargo and it's sturdy cargo, I can make that very short and accelerate pretty hard. And then a little bit of engine power once you're up there to finish your orbit and get you on your way.
Yeah.
So for the cost of that station, it would be challenging to see if that really makes sense.
Well, that's a big argument for making a moon base is as a launching point. If we did want to go to Mars, for instance, yes, it's much cheaper to launch from the moon, and maybe you manufacture the fuel on the moon.
Well, yeah, and you're exactly right. All of those things that are massive, that are expensive to lift out of the Earth's gravity well, but that we then need elsewhere, to take it out of a light gravity well, like the moon, would be much more cost effective, and you can automate it and so forth. And so the discovery of huge volumes of ice on the moon, that's when you think about what you're going to consume a lot of, oxygen and water and even liquid hydrogen are all very hefty things. You need to move a lot of it out of the moon, off the Earth. So move it from the moon could save you a ton of money.
Around the Earth, especially because of, as we talked about, what was it, the rapid decomposition?
Mm-hmm. Rapid disassembly events.
That's the one, yeah, all the explosions. And things just generally, when we send things into space at the moment, we tend to just kind of go, blur, this part's got to survive, everything else is whatever. So there's a lot of space debris around the Earth, in the near-Earth orbit, or whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. Is there that same problem at the moon?
No. For a few reasons. One is we just haven't taken a lot of stuff to the moon in the first place. The second is that the moon's gravity is fairly inconsistent. So it's actually challenging to keep things in orbit for a long time around the moon, which is why they're playing with such unusual orbits for the space station. You tend to have stuff re-enter fairly fast. Within a year, for the most part, an unpowered vehicle in a low lunar orbit will end up hitting the ground. There's these mass concentrations on the surface of the moon, largely believed to be created by major asteroid collisions, that literally vary the gravity by more than 2%, and it's enough to just disturb orbits fairly quickly. We're pretty disciplined these days, all the spacefaring nations, in making sure that as little of our rocketry stays in orbit as possible. They re-enter quickly, except for the occasional burst of craziness where a country needs to show off that they can blow up a satellite. It's just an incredibly dumb thing to do. Admittedly, the Americans did do it first, and many, many years ago. And so depending on the orbits that these debris land in, they can be up for decades. And there's a serious conversation going on right now about how to clean that up, that we could be starting to build machines that will help eliminate a lot of the debris.
Magnets and nets and whatnot.
Yeah, lasers also is a good one because you can reach substantial distances, and you only need to decelerate an object a certain amount, and the atmosphere will do the rest. So just the ability to get in front of something enough to hit it and slow it, that it ends up re-entering, so that we don't have the debris lasting quite as long. I think the last time I looked at the figures, the sort of space observers were saying there's about 20,000 man-made objects in low to medium orbit. And it's bad, but it's not crazy bad. There's this concept called the Kessler syndrome, which is that we now have enough things in orbit, mass debris, that it's starting to collide with itself and make more debris. And we have had incidences. We have had 2 satellites, unexpectedly collide. One was a dead Soviet satellite, and the other one was one of the Iridium satellites.
What are the odds? They're tiny.
They're pretty remote, you would think, but it's crowded enough that actually happened. And of course, then creates a whole lot more debris. Some of which is going to re-enter because it was decelerated by the impact, but some of it was accelerated by the impact and moved to higher orbits as well. And it's not like a sign pops out when you're in the syndrome, right? And says, okay, congratulations. It's only because it'll keep happening. Yeah. So the concern is whether we're actually there. And I'm not convinced that we are. And it is interesting to see that we're seeing more initiatives around trying to deal with that. And certainly, for the most part, with modern launches, we're pretty good about making sure we get rid of our expense stages and things.
That's good to hear. Well, Richard, I could talk to you about this all day, and we pretty much have all morning. But we've got to wrap it up there. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.